So I have Nick Pyatt, who is a climate change specialist working with Climate Sense. He has worked in adaptation to climate change for the last 10 years, and prior to that, he specialized in natural resources management. Nick is from the United Kingdom. Now, Professor Revocatus Twinomuhangi, the Dean of Forestry.
Forestry, Environmental and Geographical Sciences.
At Makerere University, and he's a professor at the university. His background is in geography, but he has also specialized in environment management, has been teaching and doing research for over 20 years.
On climate change.
What I've always found really interesting is how people get into climate change. Some people say climate change is a recent thing. Some people say it's been around for a very, very long time. So I'm always interested in hearing how the people who are active in the climate change space got into it. So I'll start with you, Professor. How did you get into climate change? I know your background has geography to it, but that still doesn't clearly point to climate change.
So how I went into the field of climate change, I was doing a UNESCO course, UNESCO course.
But we said this is an acronym-free podcast.
Yeah?
We said it's an acronym-free podcast. UNESCO?
UNESCO and UNEP.
Those
UNEP.
are two acronyms.
Yes.
We shouldn't have
Nations.
acronyms. Okay.
Yeah, for United Nations Environment Program had a course on waste management and life cycle assessment in Germany. I did that course for 2 months. So when we were doing the waste management stuff, it's when I came to realize that waste is a major source of greenhouse gases that cause climate change. And my doctoral research was on waste management, so that's how I transformed into climate change, from waste management to climate change, because wastes are a source of greenhouse gases that cause climate change.
What's very interesting for me, and also because you're a professor, so are we allowed to say teacher?
Yes.
Also, yeah, is that most of the people that I speak with around climate change, and I try to find out how they got into this space, will speak about getting the training from elsewhere. And very few of them, or none of them at this point, have told me they got that training from within Africa, within East Africa. Why is that?
Yeah, because of the specialities. At that time, I don't think we had specialists in climate change. So, and also the idea of climate change and what causes it has been coming from these advanced countries. So the science, the literature has been coming from the advanced countries. So it's about expertise.
Yeah. That makes sense. Nick, how did you get into climate change? You said this was about 10 years ago, but before that you were in natural resources management. So somehow these things are always related.
Okay. Like many of us, and possibly like the good professor, completely by accident. I wasn't looking for it. So the first engagement was actually with people who are my colleagues now, but not because of their climate change work. It was because they started to describe a way of understanding organizations and processes which helped answer a question I had. Why is it when we were told train people and their capacity is built, when actually we train people, or I had been trained most often? I was really excited when I left the training, went back to my desk, and it was so difficult to implement the training, I just went back to doing what I did before. And what is it that changes behavior? And these people had done some really interesting work in unpacking in a way which made sense to me. And when I went out into my other work at that time, it started to make sense. Okay, this person is at this point thinking of things in this way. These are the barriers or enablers to their being able to move to a way of being or behaving or acting which is different. And they understand to be better, but can't reach that. So I went and talked to them a bit more and found that they were doing this in relation to climate change. So I started to understand more about their climate change adaptation work. And also it started to make a lot of sense, and realizing that my training as a forester and my specialization in my early days as a proper forester in the field, which was planting trees, encapsulated the disciplines we need to think about in adapting to climate change. And that is, when you're planting a small tree which may be 15 centimeters high, you have to think about that tree when it is 20, 30 meters high. And the environmental conditions it needs to think about, or you need to think about for it and plan for, are completely different to those experienced by a 15 centimeter high tree. And so many other things which are risks which are not present at that point, you need to anticipate when you're planning the design of your forest. And that is absolutely the set of questions we need to think about when we're thinking about adaptation. We need to think about the risks over the life of the decision we are making, which are not present today, but we need to factor into the decisions we make today.
You've gone a little ahead of me, Nick, and I'm going to have to ask you to explain that again when I come to adaptation. Sure. We've been trying on the podcast to understand climate change as opposed to environment, the changing environment and so on. Are there particular disciplines that you could list that would help us understand what is climate change and what is not climate change?
Okay. That's a really good question. So there is a rule of thumb that is applied in the climate adaptation field, which is this. If we assume a starting point that we are resilient to the current climate, now that's complicated and we can come on to that later, but let's start with that assumption. Then, if we're resilient to the current climate, we're used to weather being different from year to year. Okay, so we can probably absorb a bit of climate change. Okay, so maybe 10 years worth of climate change. So if we can change or renew what we're doing and our resilience levels to climate within 10 years, let's not worry too much about climate change. However, if we're looking beyond climate, 10 years, then the level of climate change may start to be reaching levels where the design for the current climate isn't resilient. And then you invite yourselves to start asking questions. So that's a simplistic start, because climate change is already happening. It's already happening. So we may be living with or being invited to engage with something which is designed for the past, but is not resilient to the current climate. And so you also need to ask that question. And a very good reference point I would invite listeners of this podcast to look at is episode 2 of your podcast, where the unfortunate extension worker is talking about his experience of going and telling them the messages he has been asked to deliver. And the farmers are saying, you're lying to us. Your messages do not reflect our current experience. Any farmer I've talked to here in Uganda, the first thing, within 5 minutes they say, the rains are no longer dependable in the way they used to be. Yet his message says, plant in June. And they know it's wrong. So he is carrying a message designed 20, 30, 40 years ago, who knows? But it's no longer relevant today. And that is causing damage. So we need to look at the past, the climate change that has happened, and into the future.
Professor, when you're listening to it, to what Nick is saying, what have you seen in Uganda from when you first had this interface with climate change? I don't know how many years ago that was. I don't even want to ask you, but you could tell me. What have you seen that you'd say, yeah, this is climate change from that time and now? That, yeah, this is climate change.
Maybe let me first build on the question you asked, Nick, about climate change and environment. We have two principal words there, climate and environment. So when we're talking about the climate of a place, we're talking about the average weather conditions. We experience weather, we never experience climate.
Explain that very slowly.
What we experience is weather, which are the atmospheric conditions at a particular place at a given time. And the main parameters in which we experience weather is through temperature, rainfall, and maybe humidity. There are others, but the main ones are those two, temperature and rainfall. So these parameters can be measured on a weather station so we can know the temperature of a place at a given time. But when we talk about daily temperature, it means we are looking at the average temperature for the day. So we can have average temperature for a day, for a month, for a year. Those, we calculate them. So, and climate, we are talking about what we expect or experience over a long period of time. So those are statistics. So now, this climate has always varied. It always changes. So we call that a variation in climate. Now, this climate that we are talking about has an influence on very many things. The climate has an influence on the vegetation cover. It determines the vegetation cover that is in a place. It determines which crops you can be able to grow. It determines the availability of water. Of course, in different states, water can be in form of solid ice, water vapor, or it can be the liquid that we know as water vapor. And when we are talking about rainfall, it's just a change in the state of water influenced by the temperature. So climate influences almost everything that we can do and we have. So climate has an influence on the environment, which are our surroundings, but also the environment affects the climate. So that's very important. These are always reinforcing. So I talked about the variability in climate or in weather. It always changes. You can be hot, you can have rainfall, you can have a drought. That is natural within the nature setting. But what we have experienced over the years is that we are having a trend where the global temperatures are increasing. So it's no longer just variability, but taking a direction where temperatures are increasing and in an unsustainable way and caused by human activity, something that now we term as global warming. And when you have this warming, it influences other variables within the climate system that we now term it as climate change. So, since 1800, now we are going back to the Industrial Revolution. This is when some of these problems started coming about. the global temperatures have increased averagely by 1 degree centigrade up to today. And we expect that these temperatures are likely to increase by between 1.5 degrees to 3.5 degrees over this century. Now, this is where the problem is. Because when you have these global the temperatures rising consistently, and they're going to affect other variables within climate, like rainfall patterns, like the melting of glaciers, for example, rise in sea level, heat waves, and drought. This is the problem that we are talking, because it brings about extreme weather events that were never experienced in the magnitude in which they are today. And these we expect to become worse as we move forward in the century.
What have you seen specific to Uganda in the last, and we keep saying 30 years, 20 years, 10 years, what have you seen that you point to and say, yeah, that's climate change, it's here, it's no longer a thing in the books?
Okay, let me start with the books, with the science. For Uganda, we have seen in the last century temperatures rising by between 0.8 to 1 degree centigrade. And that is the start of the problem. But in terms of what we have seen changes in rainfall patterns, and Uganda being an agricultural country, it has significant impact. So previously, people had a farming calendar and they knew when to plant, but now they are not sure whether the rains will come when they are expected, and whether the rains will have the duration of the rains, say in a season. So sometimes you have late rainfall coming at a later stage than it used to be, and these rains ending quite early, so the farming calendar is distorted, and the farmers cannot be able to plan.
So that's what Nick was speaking about with what the farmers are saying, and this extension worker not knowing or not being able to give them the information that they need.
Yes, and of course that points now to climate information, the lack of climate information, reliable climate information. The other issue that we have seen are the rainfall events are becoming more intense. So maybe you have few rainfall days than we used to have, like in a year or in a month. But when the rains come, they are quite very heavy. They are storms and causing damage. So intense rainfall events that result in flooding, in destruction of crops, in destruction of infrastructure. We have seen prolonged droughts, which limit or reduce water availability for both crops, for livestock, and for human consumption. In many places, like for example, where they have dug boreholes, over time, the water table reduces, and these water boreholes are not able to give them the water that they expect. In some areas like Karamoja, you have riverbeds, no longer rivers and streams. These rivers have dried up or have become seasonal. In places like southwestern Uganda, which had lower temperatures, because the temperatures have increased, you have now prevalence of mosquitoes, and you have prevalence of malaria increasing. So quite really, recently we have been talking, at one point we were talking about the water levels in Lake Victoria reducing. Today we are talking about the water levels increasing, and because of the increased rainfall events within the water basin.
What surprises me is I keep, and the things you're saying, so especially the example of Kabale and malaria now being prevalent, most of the people that I host here speak to the same thing. So I'm beginning to understand that we don't have an information gap as big as we think we do, because clearly this is information that is known. So maybe, Nick, I want to ask a question around the barriers and the enablers to acting on the information. Why are we not acting on the information we have? But before I ask that question, the things that Professor has been speaking to, are you seeing the same in the United Kingdom?
Globally, yeah, absolutely in the United Kingdom. The more intense rainfall, absolutely. The change in the pattern of weather, longer, hotter periods, higher peak temperatures. Sometimes we have the prolonged rain, more intense rainfall, but also sometimes just endless, very low rainfall. Never goes away. And that makes flooding more likely because the water is saturated, the ground is saturated all the time. So you don't need much more rain and it flood very rapidly. So those weather patterns are already happening. Even the size of the raindrops, because the warmer air can hold more water. So when it rains, bigger raindrops. So the rain patterns are more like Uganda used to be. Uganda is now even warmer than it did, so it can have bigger raindrops, which can cause more damage. All of those trends are happening.
If we have this information, and maybe it's because I'm in a certain circle, so and the people that I'm around have this information, so maybe the information is not going out as to the wider public. Maybe I'm thinking that's really one of the reasons why maybe we're not acting.
So I think that's a really, really interesting question, and it's where as Climate Sense we start to engage with people. We work with the scientists, we work with technical specialists, but our focus area is then working with those people who need to live with all of that, make sense with it, live in their current world as it is, to work out what on earth do we do with this new thing. And to some extent, we need to be good to ourselves, because as the professor was saying, mankind is facing something it's never experienced before. If you look back at the climate records for 1 million years, we are way beyond anything mankind has faced. Our civilization of settled agriculture, urbanization, has developed over the last 10,000 years in actually quite a stable climate. There's been ups and downs, but it's been pretty stable, which has allowed those developments to happen. We're now moving into the environmental drivers of greenhouse gases that are at levels in the atmosphere way beyond anything we've experienced in over 1 million years, never mind the stability of the last 10,000 years. So our way of thinking and a way of thinking about future risk is we're being asked to think about it in ways we've never had to. The past has been a sort of good enough guide to what we should think about for the future. Now, within technological revolutions that we've experienced, then we know that technology places opportunities for the future in ways that it never has, so we're having to start thinking differently anyway. But let me give you an example of a very common experience we have when we work with technical specialists. Anywhere, this is not a British thing, anywhere. Maybe engineers, for instance. We usually turn up and we're going to talk about climate change, and they're probably thinking, who are these crazy guys? Is this climate change a thing anyway? And are they a bunch of hippies who are going to want us to, I don't know, run to the hills or something? So fairly quickly, they find that's not what we're asking them to do. We are asking them to apply their expertise to say, okay, are we resilient to the current climate? And usually we're not. And they will have a very good technical insight as to what the problems are, what we ought to do differently. Okay, so we can say that. Okay, so we then say, okay, well, this climate change thing suggests, if we're looking at temperature or flood risk or whatever it is, we move them a bit ahead and say, well, up to what level of increased temperature would, if we make all those changes to be resilient to now, up to what level of increased temperature would they still look after us? Oh, okay, well, up to that point we're okay, but if we reach this point, then we need to start doing something else.
Nick, maybe if you used an example, let's say a bridge, or let's
A
say
bridge.
a road.
Perfect, yes, a bridge. So it's a bridge. So we have a bridge. What level of water flow intensity is this bridge designed for? What water level is it designed to carry us over? Okay, well, up to that level of intensity it's designed for. If the water starts to flow more strongly, then we need to start building in more protection at this point. If the water level decreases to this level, then there's a lot of water backing up behind the bridge. We need to think about flooding. We even need to think about the structure of the bridge. Okay, so they can start to unpack that. So we can then say, okay, well, and they start to get quite excited because they start to see their technical training equips them to understand A, what the implications are, and B, what to do. Or to say, this is something we haven't faced for, these are the questions we need to ask. So at least find a pathway to change. So emotionally they go up, their condition starts to get better. But emotionally they come down pretty quickly into a darker place than they were before. Because they then look back into the way their organisation makes decisions, thinks about risk, and see that many of those things they now see are absolutely sensible professionally, do have no value in the organisation's process. The organisation, when it's thinking about future risk, will maybe think about 3, 4, 5 years ahead, not the period that they need to be thinking about, which may be many decades, especially as engineers, right?
It must be very expensive to think a decade ahead as you're designing a bridge.
No,
No,
it isn't.
No, it's not?
No,
because
you can then decide what are the points at which we normally upgrade. Okay, we normally upgrade at that point anyway. So we wait to that point and we think about, okay, what are the future climate things we need to factor in when we're going to be upgrading anyway? So it may be a little bit more, but not necessarily a whole lot more. If you factor in at that moment the climate change you need to factor ahead.
And then it's cheaper in the future.
And then it's cheaper in the future because you're managing that risk. There is another aspect I need to bring in, however, also, that different people have different opportunity to make change. So I've been thinking about these questions here in Kampala, right? There is a privileged life. Let's think about temperature. There's a privileged life we can lead. Some people can lead where you move from your air-conditioned home to your air-conditioned car, from your air-conditioned car to your air-conditioned office. And you wouldn't know what the temperature was. If you're a boda driver, right, and the temperatures start hitting 35 degrees more regularly, 40 degrees, that's not a good life. That's not what the system around which Kampala was depended upon was designed for. And yet those people have very little capability to change their fortune in that, change their exposure. Our system isn't designed to even think about them. And yet they are the ones who have to absorb the impact of that and carry the suffering. And may possibly affect, if they have to change the way that they do things, the organism, which is Kampala, may have to change in ways that it's not designed to.
Professor, you wanted to jump in at some point, but if you don't, I have a question for you, very related to this. There's a paper of yours that I dug up online. It's called Perceptions and Vulnerability to Climate Change Among the Urban Poor in Kampala City, Uganda. What were you thinking while Nick was speaking about this border rider who is dealing with what, 30 something degrees?
More than 35 degrees, it's starting to hit 40s.
Ooh, well, what I can say is that, as Nick was saying, the climate change is global, but its impacts are local. So different areas are going to be affected differently, but within the same community, you have people also affected differently. So in Kampala City, about 60% of the population lives in informal settlements and slums. And many of these slums where the poor people live are in the valleys, and many of them are reclaimed swamps. And these people are living there, and the housing, we're talking about resilience. Resilience is about the ability to absorb shock. So many of these poor people, the houses that they have there are not permanent buildings. They are temporary buildings which can easily be destroyed by extreme weather patterns, including if it was extreme wind or a storm or floods, and they don't have alternatives. So it's my thinking when we're writing this paper, doing the research, is who is impacted most. It's the poor people, the vulnerable people, because they don't have means of building resilience. So they cannot build good housing that can withstand a flood. They have maybe like one source of income which is not adequate, so that when it is affected, then they have no food, maybe no clothing. These are people who maybe who are not supplied with proper infrastructure in terms of like good roads. So if there is a flood, the children will not go to school, for example, in the morning. They cannot access easily a health facility. They will not have food. So that was our thinking when we were looking at the impacts of climate change. So if you compare with somebody who is living on the upper slope with good housing, a permanent house, the place is well supplied with electricity, with a road, the person has a car, there's good sanitation, and you compare with this guy in the valley without proper sanitation, and then there is flooding, and the water is contaminated. So you can see really the impacts we are talking about.
So two things there for me. The first one, what needs to happen to help that guy in that community adapt or respond to these impacts of climate change? How do they even start to respond?
First, these people shouldn't have been there anyway.
They don't have an option.
If we had proper planning, we are planning for our people, because an urban area is a planned space. Every building, wherever it is, whichever infrastructure, wherever it is, should be planned. So we need to improve our planning in the city. Well, when people are already there, it's about going into this area and improve it, put in proper drainage to reduce the flooding, to help these people put up proper housing, permanent housing that can be resilient when a storm comes or when there is a flood, giving them the services they need, because like one of the things that affects them, one of the issues is about water and sanitation. So if they have clean water, if they have good garbage waste management services, if they have proper sanitation. Those are some of the means that increase their resilience. But also, as a city, you need to improve planning so that people don't go into these marginal areas. We regenerate, we help rehabilitate and restore wetlands and urban forests and vegetation to be able to increase our ability to deal with, to address disasters which come with climate change. But the way they are on their own.
So I had said two things, and the second thing, listening to both of you speaking, is how wide climate change is, because some of the things you're pointing to, we've spoken about agriculture, we've spoken about how climate change affects more vulnerable communities. We've also we're hinting a little bit about the health of these communities as a result of climate change, and yet it's never a very direct relationship until you start to look back and think, okay, this came out of this, and so on and so on. Maybe speak to us a little bit, Nick, about how wide this conversation of climate change. We've focused heavily on agriculture on this podcast, but listening to you speak about infrastructure and now health and so on, it would be interesting to get a bit into that.
That's interesting. So anything that has to manage an interface with the climate, as broad as that, the climate is something we live in. So let me think of some extremes which are non-agricultural. Okay. So let's start with the socioeconomic issue that you were so beautifully articulating, those challenges. The socioeconomics is fundamental because the resources we have and can draw on at any one moment in a shock affect our resilience to climate change. Right? Also our ability to anticipate. If we have more resources, we probably have more opportunity to stick back, say, okay, this is coming, let me prepare for it. If you're living from hand to mouth, you don't, even if you could, you don't have the resources to put those things in place. So even if physically, in a spatial sense, this space is subject to exactly the same climate hazard, the sensitivity and vulnerability to that hazard fundamentally changes with people's economic status, socioeconomic capability. So that is something which spreads across any particular detail of climate change, and is why and needs to be at the heart of our thinking about how we respond to climate change. But as someone who is privileged to work with organisations across a whole spectrum of things, I get surprised all the time. So I was at an event where we were looking at transport, and hearing some people who are from the worked with planes, aeroplanes and air travel. And apparently hotter temperatures affect the distance a plane has to take off. So if you have hotter days, you need a longer runway. And so already some airlines are finding that if they're going into a hot place, they have to reduce the amount of weight that they can carry, because the airline, the runway isn't long enough to take off with a full load for a colder place. So, it's a first world problem of air travel, but nonetheless, it takes you to some interesting places, right? But also then the detail of some simple lives. So let me take to. I'm going to go back to agriculture, if you will, because it's where the agriculture is thing is, or anything. Where do we build something? The planning idea, right? So I've just been having a conversation with some people about biodigester plant, right? These people want their biodigesters to be viable for 25 years. We're building into the conversation, even this is for smallholders, saying, okay, well, over that 25 years on that smallholder site, with heavier rainfall, there may be risk of surface water flooding on that farm site, which doesn't exist at the moment. So can you talk to your technical people who are working out the best place to place the biodigester? Where's the best place? And think ahead. Think where the low points are that may become vulnerable to more extreme rainfall, and don't put it there. Okay? So anything where you have to think about the place in the climate, and sometimes because being good to ourselves, understanding we're moving into a situation we've never experienced before, sometimes it takes time for people to think like that. And that's the other aspect, is getting into people's minds. And also that aspect of, well, that's in the future, it's not my job, someone else can deal with it. Okay. So the biggest driver we find to start things off is that people have to do it. Somebody who is important to them says, I want to see you doing it. That's the thing that gets people started most often. And then they start to learn, and they start to, okay, actually I've been doing this and I can see why it's a sensible thing to do. Then they start to take ownership.
The sensible thing to do. That's a very important...
the sensible thing to do.
Yeah.
And we'll come back to this. What is sensible? I would invite us to revisit, because that changes with our experience.
And just to add on, we have to also know that when we do adapting now, we are adapting to the current climate. Okay? But the future climate, so whatever things that we put in place to build resilience today, will not be able to build our resilience in 10 years. Because by that time still there will be more and more changes in the climate. Let me put it this way. We have not talked about the causes of climate change, which are greenhouse gas emissions, and where they come from. And that even if we stopped emitting today, emissions are zero. The concentration of the greenhouse gases that we have in the atmosphere will keep our planet warming for the rest of this century. So, all those sensible things that we are thinking about, there must be the short term, the medium term, and the long term. And the only way we can have a sustainable way of addressing the climate is to deal with the cause of the change. He was talking about a bridge or a road. Engineers normally do this modeling. So they're going to say, okay, we have a bridge here, but what is the probability that it's going to flood? How many times does it flood in a year or in a 10-year return period? And then they're going to design a bridge that is going to withstand those what?
That period of
that period, the threats. But here we are, that every time that passes, the occurrence, the probability of occurrence of flooding becomes more frequent and more intense. So if you have designed a bridge to last 50 years, it means that if you don't consider the future changes, this bridge is going to be destroyed in 10 years. And we have seen it. We have put up roads, and within 5 years, they are worn out.
We have seen it.
Yes.
Yeah.
So you have done an investment plan for 30 years, but now it's off because of these threats, and you have to rebuild the same road. So, previously we talked about information, that we have information. Yes, we have information, but we don't have complete information. And there is always uncertainty in all these things that we're talking about. And when you have uncertainty, that's why we talk about risk. Now, the information is global. We know the temperatures, we have modeled. You go on your computer, you put in a model. Maybe under this scenario, if you have a population increasing at this rate, emissions increasing at this rate, you're going to have these what? These temperatures. But at the local level, you need finer information. Because a farmer will need information, daily information, monthly information, seasonal information. You will need to understand the length of a season. But you also need daily information to know which day do I plant my crops. And if I can't plant them, are there other ways that I can be able to plant, even if there is delayed rain? Even if there is a shorter season, are there varieties of crops that I can grow and able to mature in a shorter season? So now, the information required is so intensive and so multi-sectoral that everybody has a role to play.
You keep speaking about greenhouse gases.
Yes.
We have these countries that have produced the most greenhouse gases to fuel their development, and they're telling us in Uganda that we have to not develop like they did because of this and this. And meanwhile, they continue to develop their own fossil fuel industries. How do you feel about that, Professor? I'm not looking at Nick right now.
Well, as a scientist, as a scholar, I think we have to, you see, there is the politics of climate change. There is the economics of climate change. There are those engineering aspects of climate change. What you need to understand is that, yes, people can design solutions, but the solutions are going to be implemented by countries, and what you are bringing about is the politics of climate change. And in climate change, there are winners and losers. You're already talking about fossil fuels, you're already talking about energy, and you know the richest companies, the most powerful countries are in that energy debate. So the more you go into that landscape, the more you go into a slippery area. But let me say it this way.
Sit upright, yes.
We know the cause of climate change, and we know that it is human beings. And we know that it's because of consumption patterns. The population increase and the need for the things that we consume. And we talked about the Industrial Revolution. So the beginning of this climate change debate are the fossil fuels. The coal, the oil, petroleum, the cement. Yeah? So what is happening is that we are getting the carbon that was stored millions of years ago, burning it and introducing that carbon back into the atmosphere. And we know that carbon dioxide is the main source of what? Of greenhouse gases. So there is no doubt that the industrialized countries are responsible for the greater part of emissions as we talk now. And we are talking about sustainable and renewable energy going into the future, the energy transition and green transition. So the attribution is these countries caused the green what? Gases. But that's not that's not the whole story. The other sources of greenhouse gases is deforestation. We have forests that have stored carbon for millions of years, but we are now clearing them and extending our farmlands, clearing and tampering with many other issues. Like, for example, when you clear forests, they are now, we talk a lot about zoonotic diseases. Eh? As we go into the forest, we increase our interaction with animals and we start getting those diseases that never used to be there. But also so for me, it's a shared responsibility. I don't think these countries knew that they were causing a problem when they were doing this, but now we know the solution. And that is why each country is, in terms of the global solution and implementation, and because we have the Paris Agreement where the aim is to keep temperature rise within 2 degrees in this century, and each country commits itself on what it can be able to do to contribute to that global goal. So those who are emitting more definitely have a responsibility to mitigate more than the developing countries. And in this debate, because you see, climate change is a development problem. It's not just, because it affects every sector. So you have Uganda, you put up a vision, and you put up a national development plan, and you are saying agriculture is going to grow by this, industry is going to grow by this percentage, and all that, and then you have these disasters coming, and nothing happens. So it's a development problem. It's not just an environmental problem. So there is no question about it. Every country has a responsibility to mitigate, but within their means, especially developing countries like Uganda, that the path you take to deal with climate change should not impede that country from growing and developing and transforming society. After all, we have already said in the social economics that if you have people who are economically well off or better, they have the ability to withstand these shocks than the people who are very poor.
Nick, do you want to weigh in on that, or should I move on to my next question?
I can only support what the professor was saying and thank him for his generosity in that description. That from originating from the country who invented the internal combustion engine and built a whole society addicted to fossil fuel. I can't claim any direct link to that. My family were very humble and were somehow benefited from that in the industrial centres in Manchester and what have you. We also died because of the smog. But I think if we can move beyond the blame game, then, and one of the exciting things is to watch a younger generation than mine who are looking at the older generation and saying, you lot have let us down, and a collective effort to say, well, how do we what are the opportunities for changing our future, then that's quite interesting. I think though there are issues that sometimes the reducing emissions issue is any difference that any one of us can make is quite small. Where there's a priority of effort, especially where the emission footprint remains quite small, is to make ourselves more resilient to the climate change that will happen. And many people have more agency and more ability to make those changes. And sometimes where you have limited resources and there's a balance, as the professor was saying, if we're a bit better off, we may be more resilient. But it does getting better off increase our environmental footprint? Well, it may do a bit.
Yeah.
And so we have to make judgments about that. And certainly for those people who are least well off, most vulnerable, whose heritage has least to do with the issue, one can't help but imagine it's fair and just to allow those people to become more resilient.
Yeah, but just to add on, maybe not complicating things. The way things are going, by 2050, developing countries will be emitting more than the developed countries we talk now, who we say are the causes of climate change. So it's about a green transition, that we transit to more sustainable ways of production and consumption. So at the moment, if we talk about Uganda, the priority is dealing with the disasters, to poverty. At the beginning, we were talking about why we're not addressing climate change, because sometimes we have more imagined problems, like the problem of poverty. This intragenerational equity that we are addressing, this is an immediate problem.
We have many competing priorities.
Yes, many competing priorities, but they are reinforcing. You will not address poverty without addressing climate change for Uganda. And you hope to succeed, because the changes in climate are perpetuating poverty. There are many people who have gone out of poverty, but they are at the borderline and can slide back into poverty by just one disaster. Okay? So we have to address poverty and resilience to climate change at the same time.
How do we I'm going to ask 3 questions, and then you can each respond to them in closing. How do we future-proof ourselves around climate change? And that's if we need to. Should we be doing anything at all about that? And what is our urgent call now? And the 3rd question is, how do we seize making climate change an elite people's problem?
I will start with the
last question.
The last question. Climate change is everybody's problem. The elites are talking about it and writing about it, but the communities and the poor are experiencing it. Yeah? So it's everybody's problem. The elite have to bring about that awareness so that people appreciate that there is a problem. And by the way, when you are addressing the risk, you threaten. Because risk, there is that probability that may take place or not take place, and it is in the future. And many people would want to deal with immediate what? Problems. So, for me, the elite are very important in this debate to be able to point at the problem, structure the problem, and be able to point at solutions. the people in the communities are experiencing this, and they are actually the solutions to this problem by doing their farming well, by protecting the environment, and by increasing their welfare so that they become more prepared for the future changes in climate. So, a big problem, where you start from is where you're affected most. So for the farming communities, for example, they need to engage in sustainable agriculture, in climate-smart agriculture. Say, for example, if we're talking about drought, they need solutions to do some bit of irrigation so that they are not affected by these vagaries of nature. So, as I said, depending on where everybody is, there is some role they can be able to play to contribute to addressing the challenge of climate change. Starting with building resilience today, but we know that the climate is going to continue changing. The only way to address this problem in the future is to address the causes of climate change by mitigating greenhouse gas emissions.
What's the urgent call now?
The urgent call? The urgent call, one, is to build awareness in the communities by providing accurate and reliable climate information so that the people can know what is at stake, what will be at stake, and be able to prepare. And then give them the means, increase their ability. Whether we know that many of these solutions are technical, so we need the technical solutions, but also the finance. This is the subject that we don't talk about most. These communities will not be able to implement all these things we are talking about if they don't have access to finance.
Thank you, Professor. Nick, my 3 questions. Should I repeat them?
Yes, please.
How do we not focus climate on the elite? How do we let everybody know that it affects everybody? And then how do we future-proof if we must? And what's the urgent call?
Okay. Please don't leave out the elites, because they are as much part of the problem and the solution as anyone else. So if we're looking at the pathway to change, I absolutely support what the professor was saying. Elites are part of this. So let me step back and talk about some of the conversations we have. Because we try and bring a whole system of decision makers who affect an outcome together to discuss this issue. One of the first questions we ask is, are there any decisions or options that you have to act on climate change where your options aren't affected by someone else's decision? We've asked many people that question. Nobody has said, no, I'm completely free to make my own decision. I'm unaffected by anyone else's decisions. So the options that each of us has to act is affected by other people's decisions, whether they know it or not. And so understanding that this is a systemic thing. And what we find is that, of course, the point about being an elite is they are maybe towards the top of a pyramid of a decision system. Okay, so the options, the decisions those elites make affect the options that other people have. So getting the elites to require of or expect of other people in the system certain behaviours will change the opportunities for other people. Okay, so that concept of what we expect of others and of ourselves, changing options in the system, I think is an important one. So elites, whether social, political, economic, that's important. So that comes to finance, financial elites, what do we want from people? Central banks are now looking at whole systems, governments, regulators. But also, and then asking about the whole systems. So for a small farmer, they might be able to change their crop between years. They can do that. But the whole system that determines what varieties of crop, maize, whatever it is, that they have available to move to if the climate changes, depends upon a whole complex system, a whole breeding system, a whole market system. So somebody needs to be in a position to anticipate out in the system so that a whole complex system makes it available for the farmer to make the change at that time, right? So it's lots of interdependencies. Some people have different levels of agency. Okay.
Future-proofing.
Future-proofing, that's what future-proofing is. Okay, so first of all is work out, is this a thing which could be knocked off course by climate change over the life we want it to function? A breach? Probably. A year's crop? Probably not. A system that produces the availability of crops in 10 years' time? Yes, we need to be thinking about that. So work out what we need to think about climate change and what do we don't. Let's not clutter our minds with what doesn't need that attention. Okay? And then also think about, is there something we can be very clear that is the solution? And that is affected by how long into the future we want this thing to last. Okay, so if we look at the way the climate is likely to change, well, there's a whole loads of way the climates are likely to change, but those possibilities, the breadth of possibilities grows the further into the future we look. So if we're sort of looking 10 to 20 years into the future, with the right expertise, we can probably have a reasonable stab and be reasonably sure that we can find a solution which will match the challenge we understand. Beyond 20 years into the future, the range of possibilities becomes so wide that our risk management process has to be a different risk management process. It has to say we are wanting to be functional in a space into which we have to expect things we can't anticipate. Okay, we cannot know. Reasons we cannot know, not that because people are being stupid, but we cannot know what levels of emission we're going to emit. Even if we knew exactly what levels of emission we're going to submit, the complex system upon which we're depending, what rate are the ice caps going to melt? We've never been there. We don't know. Yeah. So there's those levels of uncertainty. So our risk management has to factor in our ability to spot and respond to things we don't expect. That's a whole new way of managing risk we're not used to.
What can we do now?
We can spot the things which we need to pay attention to or not. We can work out what level of uncertainty we can apply and what the appropriate risk measures are. Okay. So they're the things that technically can be done. Those are quite relatively straightforward. The things we need to work on is the systems to allow us that will say, we expect those decisions of you. And that's a whole other socio-political, economic shift that podcasts like this are helping to generate. So thank you for the podcast.